Ventilators are undoubtedly very important machines, particularly right now, but what do they actually do? How do they actually work? Well, a ventilator pushes gas into the patient's lungs and then stops pushing to let the gas back out. But rather than treat it as a mysterious device, let's look at it a bit more closely. So, what goes in and what comes out? In most hospital ventilators, three important things are given to our ventilator. The first is electricity. This keeps it running, but also ventilators mostly have computers built into them, and they need power. Secondly, we have high pressure air, usually from a socket in a hospital wall. And thirdly, similarly, we have high pressure oxygen. Inside the ventilator, the air and the oxygen are mixed, and this mix is then given to the patient. But how much air and how much oxygen? This is controlled by a set of valves, which we'll come on to in a minute, but it essentially depends on what the patient needs. Air is about 20% oxygen and 78% nitrogen, and it's the oxygen from it that we need to keep us alive. If the lungs are less able to absorb oxygen, then there needs to be more oxygen in the mix to make sure the person can always get enough. A doctor controls the amount of oxygen added by the ventilator, also known as the partial pressure of oxygen. So what are these valves that control the flow of gases in a ventilator? Well, they're important to make sure that the right amount of the right mix of gases is going to the right place at the right time. The simplest valve is just to have an opening of a certain size that restricts gas flow. But most valves need to be controllable. For example, this is a solenoid valve. A solenoid valve uses a tiny electromagnet to do the controlling. When electricity is put into a coil of wire, also known as a solenoid, the coil, the solenoid, becomes magnetic. An actuator, which is the moving part of the valve, is attracted to the magnet and the valve opens. But if you turn off the electricity, the solenoid is no longer magnetic, so the actuator is no longer attracted to it, and the valve closes. The valves in our ventilator are controlled by the dedicated mini computer that's built into the ventilator. It makes sure the right valves are open and closed at the right time to give the patient the breaths they need. There's usually one more thing between a ventilator and a patient, and that's a humidifier. This makes sure that the air going into the lungs is not too cold and not too dry. And a doctor can change the settings to suit the needs of the patient. They can change the amount of gas being pushed out on each breath. This is sometimes called the tidal volume, so they can create big breaths or small ones. They can also change how often the ventilator produces a breath, the frequency of the breathing. So, to sum it all up, the ventilator takes in air and oxygen, mixes them in the right proportions, and pushes that gas out through a humidifier and into the patient's lungs, where oxygen is absorbed into the bloodstream and carbon dioxide is released. The ventilator then stops the gas flow into the patient, and the patient's lungs deflate naturally, gently pushing the used gas back to the ventilator, where it is there released. And the whole process begins again. By breathing for them, a ventilator can help a patient get the vital oxygen they need into their body. It is a life-saving machine.